The night Tommy texted me, I was sitting in my old recliner, half watching a late-night documentary and half thinking about how quiet the house had become since Linda left. The rain had been tapping on the roof for hours, but I remember it suddenly growing heavier, as if the sky itself was trying to warn me. I stared at my phone for a moment, his message glowing in the dim light. "We need to talk. Come by the office. It's urgent." There was nothing unusual in his tone, just a hint of pressure, the kind brothers use when they want something but won't say it outright. I didn't think twice. Tommy was family. He'd been my right hand in business for more than 2 decades. If he said it was urgent, then it was urgent. I grabbed my coat, keys, and umbrella and stepped out into the storm. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt, and the streetlights blurred through the downpour. Every step I took toward that office felt heavy, but I couldn't tell if it was the rain weighing me down or something deeper, something unspoken, waiting for me at the other end. I didn't know I was walking toward the moment that would split my life clean in two, before and after. Our company had been my life's work. I started it with Tommy back when we were barely scraping by. We built it from an old garage, from long nights and borrowed money from trust, or what I thought was trust. Over the years, we'd turned that little repair shop into one of the most respected logistics firms in the state. My name was on the paperwork, but I always said it was our company, because that's how I saw it, us against the world, brothers in business and in blood. I used to joke that no contract, no storm, and no betrayal could ever tear us apart. I should have known better. When I reached the office that night, the building was dark except for Tommy's light on the second floor. I still remember looking up at that window, seeing his shadow pacing behind the blinds, and feeling an odd tightness in my chest. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't name it. The parking lot was empty. No clients, no staff, just me and the storm. I climbed the stairs, my shoes leaving wet prints on the old wooden steps, and pushed open the door. Tommy was standing by the window, phone in hand, pretending to be calm. But he wasn't. His hands were shaking. I could see it even in the dim light. He turned when he heard me, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Rob. Thanks for coming," he said, voice low, uneven. "What's going on?" I asked. "You said it was urgent." He hesitated. Then he motioned for me to sit. That hesitation, that single pause, still echoes in my memory. Because I realize now that he was trying to convince himself that he could do it, that he could go through with what he'd already decided. "I've been talking with some of our investors," he began. "They're not happy. They think we've been too cautious. They want to make some changes," I frowned. "What kind of changes?" He looked down at his hands. "They want you out, Rob." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. I even laughed, thinking it was a bad joke. "You mean they want us to step down?" He didn't look up. "No, just you." That's when my chest went cold. My own brother, the man I trusted more than anyone, couldn't even meet my eyes while he said it. My voice cracked when I asked, "You're not serious?" Tommy's silence was all the answer I needed. I stood up, staring at him like I was seeing him for the first time. "You went along with this?" I demanded. "After everything we built? After everything we've been through?" He finally looked at me then, and I saw guilt flicker across his face. But there was something else behind it. Fear, maybe. Or greed. "They offered a buyout," he said softly. "A big one. Enough to clear all the debts, enough to set us up for life." "Us?" I asked. "Or just you?" He didn't answer. In that moment, I felt the ground fall out from under me. 25 years of trust, brotherhood, and sacrifice collapsed into dust. All those nights we'd worked late, all those times I'd covered for his mistakes, all the money I'd poured into keeping us afloat. Gone. He'd sold me out. And for what? A paycheck. I remember my hands trembling, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own voice when I whispered, "You already signed it, didn't you?" Tommy looked away again, and that was it. Confirmation. The storm outside raged louder, lightning flashing through the window like a cruel spotlight. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to break every piece of that office so he'd feel even a fraction of what I felt. But all I could do was stand there, silent, watching my own brother destroy everything we'd built. He mumbled something about doing what's best for the business, about how it was inevitable. But all I heard was betrayal, the kind that doesn't just wound you, it brands you. When I finally walked out of that office, the rain had turned to a cold drizzle. The streets were empty, and I remember thinking how fitting that was, because I'd never felt more alone in my life. That night, as I sat in my truck staring at the dark sky, I realized something that would haunt me for years. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people who hug you the tightest, who know your weaknesses, who once called you brother. And that was the night. The day my family sold me out. I grew up in a small town called Millfield, Ohio. A place so small you could drive from one end to the other in 10 minutes and still have time to wave at half the town along the way. The streets smelled like rain and motor oil most days, and there was always the distant hum of someone fixing something. A lawnmower, a pickup truck, or an old fence leaning from last winter's storm. Life there wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Folks worked with their hands, earned what they had, and slept with their doors unlocked because trust was part of the air we breathed. My dad, Samuel Hayes, was the kind of man who could fix anything. Engines, roofs, fences, hearts. He was steady, reliable, the backbone of our family and half the town. He ran a tiny garage on the corner of Main Street, the kind with a flickering neon sign that buzzed louder than the engines inside. People didn't just come for repairs. They came for advice, for a cup of coffee, or for that nod he'd give when your car, or your life, needed more than just a tune-up. My mom, Ruth, ran a small diner across the street. She made the kind of apple pie that could make a man forget his troubles for a while. Between the smell of oil from Dad's shop and the scent of bacon and coffee from Mom's kitchen, that's what home smelled like to me. Work and warmth. Then one winter morning, Dad didn't wake up. Heart attack, the doctor said, quick and quiet. I was 24, just out of college with a degree in civil engineering, and Tommy was barely 19. We buried Dad under a gray sky while the snow fell in slow, silent flakes that melted as soon as they touched the ground. I remember standing there looking at the headstone and feeling this heavy truth sink in, that it was my turn now. I had to carry everything he built, every lesson he'd hammered into me about hard work and loyalty. Tommy was different. He always had his head in the clouds. While I was in the garage with Dad learning how to change a carburetor, Tommy was dreaming about skyscrapers, sports cars, and fast money. He'd flip through magazines and talk about city life, how one day he'd be somebody. I used to smile and let him talk, thinking that maybe between my steady hands and his wild dreams, we could make something real together someday. A few years later, I started Hayes & Sons Contracting. It was small at first, just me, a rusty pickup, and 2 high school friends willing to work for whatever I could pay. We fixed driveways, patched up roofs, built porches. Word spread fast in small towns, especially when you worked hard and treated people right. Every nail I hammered and every foundation I poured felt like a promise that Dad's lessons wouldn't die with him. When things finally started to grow, I brought Tommy in. He didn't know much about the business side, but I figured he could learn. After all, we were brothers. Blood was supposed to mean something. I gave him a title, co-owner, not because he'd earned it, but because I believed in him. I thought if I gave him a stake in something real, something we could build together, maybe it would settle him. Maybe he'd find the same pride in honest work that Dad taught me. For a while it worked. We were a team. I handled the field work, blueprints, crews, construction sites, while Tommy handled the office side, the clients, the contracts, the networking. I trusted him to talk to investors and suppliers while I was out in the mud, making sure every beam was straight and every man got paid on time. We grew from small-town projects to big city contracts, from building sheds to handling full-scale commercial developments. I used to drive by some of those buildings years later and feel proud, knowing our name was tied to something solid, something that would stand longer than either of us. By the time we hit our 20th year, Hayes & Sons wasn't just a company, it was an institution. 70 employees, 3 offices, and more contracts than we could handle. We gave work to men who'd grown up with us, who'd gone to school with us, who trusted the Hayes name because it stood for integrity. Every Friday I'd walk the floors, hand out paychecks, and feel that satisfaction deep in my chest, the kind that money can't buy. But somewhere along the way, Tommy started changing. It was subtle at first, a new watch, a new car, a trip to meet clients that didn't make much sense. He started talking differently too, using words like leverage, expansion, and partnerships. Words that didn't come from a man who'd spent his youth under a car hood or behind a hammer. He was restless, always chasing something bigger, something shinier. I'd ask him about the trips, the money, the new friends he was suddenly spending weekends with. He'd just grin that easy grin of his, clap me on the shoulder and say, "Relax, Rob, you're too old-fashioned. I'm just networking." That word became his favorite excuse. Whenever I caught wind of something off, a missing receipt, an expense that didn't add up, a delayed payment, he'd throw it back at me with a laugh. "You have to spend money to make money, big brother," he'd say. That's how business works these days. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Because believing the alternative meant that my own brother might be lying to me felt impossible. We'd come too far, shared too many nights fixing engines and chasing dreams. I told myself he was just ambitious, that maybe I was the one stuck in the past. But deep down I could feel the distance growing between us. It started with missed calls, skipped meetings, then full weeks where I'd barely see him at all. The man who once worked beside me under the same roof now lived out of hotels and boardrooms. One night I drove by the downtown bar where he said he'd be meeting a potential investor. His car was there, but he wasn't inside. Instead, I saw him through the window of the high-end restaurant across the street, laughing with two men in suits I didn't recognize. I remember standing in the rain watching him shake hands with them, the kind of handshake that seals deals and buries secrets. That's when something inside me shifted. I didn't know who he was shaking hands with, but I knew what it meant. He was making deals without me. Still, I kept quiet. I kept the faith because that's what family does, right? You forgive. You trust. You hope they'll come around. I told myself maybe he was just trying to grow the company in his own way. But every time I looked at him, every time he smiled that slick smile, I could feel the foundation cracking. Not the concrete kind, but the kind built on blood, loyalty, and belief. If I had known then what those networking nights were really about, the whispered deals, the secret partnerships, the quiet signatures on papers I'd never seen, maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe I could have saved the business, the brotherhood, and the name we'd built from nothing. But I didn't. I looked the other way. I kept working, trusting, building money while Tommy was already selling pieces of it behind my back. That was the setup. The slow, quiet erosion before the storm. The business we built together, the one I poured my life into, was already slipping through my hands, and I didn't even know it. The night of that meeting sits in my memory like a scar that never healed, deep, uneven, and impossible to ignore. It was the night when everything I had built, everything I believed in, was quietly stolen from beneath my feet, not by a stranger or a rival, but by the one person I had trusted most in this world, my own brother. The rain had barely stopped by the time I pulled into the parking lot that evening. The asphalt was slick, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights in broken puddles. The building stood silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights through the upstairs window. My office light, the one I always left off after hours, was burning bright. I remember thinking it was strange, almost ominous, like a warning I couldn't yet interpret. When I stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint scent of printer toner. The place was too quiet, too still. Usually at night, the office had this comforting silence, the kind that comes from exhaustion after a long day's work. But that night it felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then I saw him. Tommy was sitting behind my desk, the oak one I'd bought 20 years ago when the company first turned a profit. He leaned back in my chair, feet resting casually on the corner, the dim light bouncing off his expensive watch. The moment I saw that watch, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the watch itself, and it was what it represented. He'd bought it a few weeks earlier, an imported one that probably cost more than a month's payroll for our workers. When I teased him about it, he'd laughed it off, called it a little reward for hard work. Now I understood it was something else, a symbol of distance, of greed, of a man already living in a world that wasn't ours anymore. He looked up when I walked in and smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that comes from warmth or relief. It was controlled, tight, and a smirk wrapped in concern. "Rob, we got a problem," he said, as if he were the one trying to save us both. I shut the door behind me and asked what was going on. He gestured toward the chair across from him, my old leather chair, the one where I'd sat through countless meetings discussing budgets, safety reports, and employee benefits. I sat down, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. "The investors are pulling out," he said. "They're spooked. They think we're over-leveraged. We need to sign some new papers tonight or we lose the company." The words hit me like cold water. I'd heard rumors of investor nerves before, especially after one of our larger housing projects hit delays. But pulling out, that was news. I asked him for details, for names, for reasons. But he brushed my questions aside with that same practiced confidence he always used when he wanted to steer the conversation away from the truth. "Don't overthink it, Rob. I've been working on this for weeks. It's all handled. We just need your signature to finalize everything." He reached into a folder and slid a thick stack of papers across the desk toward me. I looked down at them. Legal language, numbers, signatures, line after line of fine print that blurred together under the dim office light. Normally, I would have read every word. That was how I worked, careful, thorough, deliberate. But that night, there was something about Tommy's tone, his urgency, the way he said "tonight," that made me feel cornered. He was tapping his pen against the desk, restless, glancing at the clock every few seconds. "Come on, Rob," he said. "We don't have time for this. They're waiting on the other end for confirmation. You trust me, don't you?" That last sentence, "You trust me, don't you?" It cut right through me. Because I did. Or at least I thought I did. This was my brother, the same kid I'd raised after Dad died, the same man I'd given half my company to when he had nothing. I trusted him not because of business, but because of blood. Because we'd been through too much together for me to believe he could ever use that trust against me. So I picked up the pen. The rain started again outside, faint at first, then louder, drumming against the windows like a countdown. Tommy flipped through the pages quickly, pointing to the spots that needed my signature. "Here and here, and one more there," he said, his voice steady but distant, almost rehearsed. I remember my own signature, the familiar loops and strokes, filling each line like small acts of faith. "Is this everything?" I asked. He nodded without meeting my eyes. "That's it. We're good." When I finally stood up, the papers neatly stacked between us, he reached out his hand. I shook it, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something flicker behind his smile. Guilt, maybe, or hesitation. But then it was gone, replaced by that same smooth grin. "Don't worry, Rob," he said. "You did the right thing. You just saved the company." I left the office that night feeling oddly numb. The rain had stopped again, leaving behind a strange, humid quiet. I drove home in silence, my mind wrestling with unease I couldn't name. Somewhere inside, I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe it. Not about Tommy, not about family. 2 days later, everything came crashing down. It started small. My security card didn't work when I swiped it at the office door that morning. The red light blinked back at me like a warning. I thought maybe it was a glitch. I tried again, still nothing. The receptionist, Megan, saw me through the glass and hurried over, her expression pale. She opened the door for me but avoided my eyes. "Morning," I said. "The card reader acting up?" She hesitated, her voice shaking. Mr. Hayes, I think you should talk to your brother," I frowned. "About what?" But before she could answer, I saw it, the new plaque on the office door. The one that used to read Hayes & Sons Contracting. Only now it said Hayes Contracting Group, owned by Thomas Hayes. For a few seconds I just stood there staring at it, unable to process what I was seeing. The name was the same, but the heart behind it, the legacy, the sweat, the years, and it was gone. Replaced by something hollow and cold, I stormed into my old office and his office now, demanding answers. But he wasn't there. His assistant told me he was in meetings. When I asked what meetings, she wouldn't say. Everyone avoided my eyes that day as if looking at me was too painful, as if they already knew what I hadn't yet accepted. It wasn't until that evening that I got the call, from the bank. The voice on the other end was polite, almost mechanical, as they informed me that my personal accounts were frozen, that the company had undergone a change in ownership, and that, as far as records showed, I no longer held any controlling interest. That's when it hit me. The papers I'd signed, the ones Tommy had slid across the desk with such urgency, weren't investor documents. They were transfer agreements. I hadn't saved the company. I'd handed it to him. He'd forged a deal, moved the assets, and rewritten the ownership in his name. Everything in the company, the vehicles, the land Dad had left us, was gone. all of it in a single night with my own pen. I remember standing in that parking lot later, clutching the useless keycard in my hand, staring up at the building that used to carry our name and feeling something inside me break. The lights in his new office were on, glowing bright against the dark sky. I could see shadows moving, his new team, his new empire, and I stood there like a ghost outside my own life. I didn't cry. Not then. There's a kind of pain that's too deep for tears, the kind that leaves you hollow instead. I just stood there, rain soaking through my coat, thinking about all the years I'd spent building that place with my own hands. Every beam, every wall, every drop of sweat, all of it stolen by the one man I would have trusted with my life. And as I turned to leave, one thought echoed in my mind over and over again. Like a curse, what kind of man sells out his own blood? The days that followed that betrayal bled together like one long sleepless night. A haze of disbelief, humiliation, and anger so deep it felt like it had settled into my bones. When I first realized what Tommy had done, I told myself there had to be a mistake, that maybe somehow it could still be fixed. After all, this was my brother. The same kid I'd taught how to ride a bike. The same man who stood beside me the day we opened our first office. Brothers fight, sure, but they don't destroy each other. They don't rip the ground out from under the person who raised them up. But Tommy didn't just take the company. He took everything that gave my life structure, everything that had my name on it. Within a week, my accounts were frozen. My email access was revoked. Even my company phone, the one I'd used for 20 years, went dead without warning. When I tried to log into the system to check on projects, I was locked out. I drove down to the site of one of our housing developments. The foreman, a guy I'd known since he was 18, couldn't even look me in the eye. "I'm sorry, Rob," he muttered. "Tommy said you're not supposed to be here." It was like watching your own reflection fade out of existence while you're still standing there, fully awake. My name was erased from everything. The trucks that once bore Hayes and Sons on the doors now read Hayes Contracting Group. My name, the one I'd built with 25 years of sweat and blood, was scraped off, painted over and replaced with his. I remember driving to his office that afternoon, still half convinced there had to be some way to reason with him. He was my brother. Surely there had to be some shred of decency left in him, some corner of his heart that remembered who we used to be. When I got there, his new receptionist and a stranger made me wait in the lobby for 20 minutes while he finished a meeting. I sat in one of those sleek, modern chairs he must have ordered to replace the old leather ones I'd picked years ago. The place looked different, cold, impersonal. My old photographs were gone, the ones of our first crew, our first build, Dad standing beside us in that faded denim jacket. They'd been replaced with glossy images of skyscrapers and city skylines we'd never even built. It wasn't a company anymore. It was an ego monument. When he finally walked out of his office, he didn't even look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked annoyed, like I was some inconvenience, some lingering obligation he'd forgotten to clean up. "Rob," he said flatly, "you shouldn't be here." "Cut the crap, Tommy," I snapped. "You stole everything. You forged documents, lied to the board, and took the company out from under me. What the hell were you thinking?" He sighed, leaned against the doorframe, and crossed his arms. That same lazy posture he used when we were kids and Dad was scolding him for skipping chores. "It's just business, Rob," he said coldly. "You were slowing things down. I had to make a move." Those words, I thought it's just business, they burned through me like acid. Just business. That's what he called it. As if betrayal was something you could file under necessary decisions. As if stabbing your own brother in the back was just part of the job description. Slowing things down? I repeated, my voice shaking with disbelief. "You mean the company I built? The one that paid your bills for 2 decades? The one you'd run into the ground if it weren't for me?" He just shrugged. "You're too sentimental, Rob. You don't understand how things work anymore. You cling to old ideas." I had to think bigger. Investors don't want someone like you standing in the way. I wanted to hit him right then, not out of rage but out of heartbreak. But all I did was stare at him, trying to find even a flicker of guilt in his eyes. There was none. Just calm, cold indifference. When I walked out of that office, I didn't realize that my downfall wasn't over yet. Tommy wasn't satisfied with taking my business. He wanted to take my name. The lies started small, whispered through town like smoke. People said I'd been gambling company money away, that I had a drinking problem, that I'd been caught embezzling funds, and that Tommy had saved the business by taking control. At first I laughed it off. Small-town gossip, I told myself. It'd die out soon enough, but it didn't. It spread faster than wildfire. Soon clients stopped calling. Longtime partners pulled out of projects. Even friends, people I'd known since high school, started crossing the street when they saw me coming. I could feel their stares, hear their half-finished whispers at the diner where my mom used to serve coffee. Such a shame. He used to be such a good man, they'd say, shaking their heads, and the worst part? They believed him. Tommy had power now. Control of the narrative, control of the money, control of the company's voice. He released a statement saying I was stepping away for personal reasons. Then he started telling everyone I'd mismanaged funds and jeopardized employee pay. It was genius, in a cruel way. He knew our town, knew how fast word traveled and how people loved a scandal more than a success story. Even my son, Evan, started asking questions. One evening he came over, his face pale, his voice careful. "Dad," he said quietly, "Uncle Tommy told me there were problems, that you might have taken money from the company. Is it true?" That question broke something in me. My own son and the boy I'd raised to believe in integrity, to believe in me, was looking at me like I was a stranger. I wanted to scream, to swear, to tell him everything, but what would that make me? A bitter old man trashing his brother? So I just said, "No, son, it's not true." My voice cracked halfway through, and that was enough. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, unsure, and left. That night I sat in my empty house, staring at the walls. The quiet felt heavier than ever. I'd gone from respected to ruined overnight. Every friend I had vanished, every account was closed, and every door that used to open with my name now shut in my face. I won't lie. There were moments I thought about giving up. When the betrayal comes from strangers, you can move on. But when it comes from blood, it's like poison in your veins. It doesn't kill you all at once. It eats at you slowly every day, until you start wondering if maybe they were right about you all along. But one morning, while I was sorting through boxes in the garage, the only space I still had left that felt like mine, I found something. It was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges, the kind that smells like dust and memory. It was me, Tommy, and Dad, standing in front of our first house build. I was holding a hammer. Tommy was grinning ear to ear, and Dad had his arm around both of us. On the back, in Dad's handwriting, were the words, "Boys never forget. Trust is your foundation." I must have read that line 100 times, my hands shaking. Trust is your foundation. Dad had always said that. Back then, I thought he meant it about business, about customers, workers, contracts. But standing there in that garage, surrounded by boxes of what used to be my life, I realized he'd meant something much deeper. Trust isn't just a foundation for work. It's the foundation of everything. Of family, of love, of who you are. And Tommy had cracked it piece by piece until there was nothing left but dust and bitterness. But something else happened that morning. As I stood there staring at that photo, something inside me, something I thought Tommy had killed, started to stir again. A fire, not rage exactly, but clarity. I wasn't done. Not yet. Tommy thought he'd buried me, thought he could erase me from the world, turn my name into a cautionary tale. But he'd forgotten one thing. Everything he knew, every deal he ever made, every trick he learned from me. So if he wanted to play dirty, he was about to remember exactly who taught him how to dig. Revenge isn't a thunderclap. It's a slow, cold weathering, the kind that takes years off a building's face until the facade finally crumbles. That's how I planned it, not with wild anger and roaring threats, but with a steady, patient dismantling of the one thing Tommy couldn't buy back: his image. Reputation was his currency now. It bought him investors, glossy brochures, and the kind of applause that hides rot. So I decided to let that currency bankrupt him. I tucked myself into the corners of my life that no one cared to look into anymore. I stopped arguing, stopped begging, and learned the power of being invisible. People mistook the silence for surrender. I let them. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. It buys you time, and time was what I needed. The first months were about listening. I drove past the Haven Estates at odd hours, noting headlights, contractors' vans, the way the model homes reflected the dawn. I sat in coffee shops near City Hall and watched men in suits come and go, their voices clipped and cautious. I learned which lawyers handled permits, which clerks signed off on foundations, and which corners of the municipal office smelled like cigarettes and fear. I kept notes, not grand plans, some small, precise observations written in the margins of bills and grocery lists. The details would matter later. An old friend, Pete, who'd worked logistics for us for years before the shakeup, slipped me a thread. "Tommy's cutting corners," he said, voice low. "People talk. Promises, undocumented subcontracts, phantom inspections. It wasn't proof, but it was a direction. I followed it." The Haven Estates was the perfect cathedral for Tommy's ambition. Glossy ads, model kitchens with marble counters, a sales office staffed by desperate men who believed in commissions. The project's financing was a house of cards, big loans based on bigger promises, pro formas that assumed everything would finish on time and under budget. If any of the permits, inspections, or invoices were false, if corners had been cut in ways that risked safety or legality, the fallout wouldn't be just embarrassment. It would be ruin. I had to be careful. Angry men rush in and break things that still have value. I needed the legal scaffolding on facts, documents, testimony that would stand in courtrooms and in headlines. So I did the sensible, unsexy work. I became a collector of proof. It started small. I tracked deliveries to the site and matched them to invoices. I requested public records one by one from the county clerk and city planning office. I sat through hearings I had no business in and watched the exchanges, learning the cadence of official language. When a subcontractor bragged at a bar about making a little paperwork stretch, he became someone who might sing if he ever needed to. I kept quiet. I kept listening. The breakthrough came when I met Linda Martinez. She'd worked in inspections for years before Tommy's kind of generosity ended her career. She was the kind of woman who carried regret like an old toolbox, heavy, familiar, and full of useful things. The first time I saw her, she was at a community meeting where a neighbor complained about foundation cracks in a row of newly built homes. She sat 2 rows back, shoulders rigid, jaw set like a hinge. "Tommy Hayes?" she said when I mentioned him. Her laugh tasted like rust. I saw his name on more than a few permits. The signatures didn't always match what I inspected. She didn't need persuasion. When I told her what he'd done to me, the papers, the cold smiles, the company turned inside out, something in her unclenched. "Let's burn him down," she said, and she wasn't joking. But Linda had crucibles of her own to cross. Blowing the whistle on construction fraud doesn't come without risk. Careers, safety, and reputations hang in the balance. We both understood that. So we started like surgeons, precise and methodical, never reckless. We mapped a plan that was legal and surgical. Linda showed me how permits were filed, where signatures could be cross-checked, and how to request historical inspection records. She taught me which sections of the building code would light up red if they'd been violated. We pulled public records requests for permit applications, inspection reports, and contractor licensing. Everything that would show the discrepancies between what the Haven Estates claimed on paper and what actually stood on the ground. Piece by piece, the evidence began to fit together. An approval stamped on a sheet bore a clerk's name that never worked late enough to approve it. An inspection form carried a handwritten note that contradicted the electronic record. An invoice for structural supports listed materials that never showed up on site. The more we gathered, the clearer the picture became. Shortcuts disguised as optimism, signed forms that had been backdated, inspections rubber-stamped by people who'd never set foot in the project. But facts alone don't topple a man who controls the narrative. Tommy had lawyers, spin, and the habit of replacing compassion with press releases. So we added witnesses. That's where Linda's quiet courage was priceless. She reached out to coworkers who'd been pushed out, to subcontractors who'd been paid late and then ghosted. One by one, men and women who'd been too ashamed or too scared to speak began to hand over scraps. Emails with vague directives, scanned copies of permits with inconsistent letterheads, voices that agreed to meet in parking lots over bad coffee because they feared showing up in daylight. Each testimony was a thread. Together they wove a case. We also needed someone who could turn paper into noise. The truth needed an amplifier. I contacted a journalist I'd known years back, Claire Dawson, an investigative reporter with a spine made of old-fashioned stubbornness and a taste for the story beneath the press release. I didn't parade to the papers with accusations. I brought Claire a few cold, verifiable leads, an inspector willing to go on record, a contractor who'd kept copies of forged forms, and a paper trail that smelted the story into something that could survive legal scrutiny. Claire didn't take a leap of faith. She took the documentation and did what good reporters do. She checked, double-checked, and pulled a few more public records of her own. When she started to ask the right questions to lenders, to city officials, to investors who'd been dazzled by renderings and timelines, the ground that had been firm under Tommy's feet began to tremble. Tommy, for all his bluster, had grown accustomed to moving fast. He thought speed was an eternal ally, so we used that against him. While he launched another glossy meeting to reassure investors, I quietly filed a complaint with the city's oversight board, providing the discrepancies we'd documented. Linda filed her own sworn statement. Claire prepared the first of what would be a series of articles, careful to cite public records and on-the-record testimony. The plan wasn't violent or lurid. It was the opposite. It was meticulous and clean. I could have tried to corner him in a confrontation and force a confession, but that plays into the gangster movies he loved. Instead, I wanted the law and the court of public opinion to do the heavy lifting. Accuse a man of theft and many will defend him on instinct. Present a stack of permits with mismatched signatures, an inspector's sworn testimony, and a banker's email asking for full disclosure. And people start to wonder which version of the truth is missing. There were setbacks. A hard drive with scanned invoices corrupted just when Claire needed it most. A subcontractor who'd promised to go public changed his mind at the last minute, terrified of losing future work. We lost nights to frustration, yet each failure taught me patience. You don't build a foundation in a week. You tamp the dirt down, you wait, you tamp again. During those long months, I became a student of small mercies. A clerk would answer the phone and confirm a filing date that contradicted Tommy's timeline. Victory. A lender would stumble over a line in a financing memo that presumed completed inspections. Victory. The town's chatter shifted imperceptibly at first from, "What happened to Rob?" to "What exactly is Tommy doing over there?" That small shift was everything. And while the outside world began to listen, I kept wearing the mask of the broken man. I let neighbors pity me, let my son ask questions I couldn't fully answer, let the bank assume I'd run out of fight. It was a strange kind of theater, humbling and necessary. People are more likely to hand you information when they don't see you as a threat. They let down their guard. Tommy, meanwhile, swaggered on stage in press photos, his teeth bright and his smile practiced. He had no idea the stage was being dismantled under his feet. The last pieces were legal. Subpoenas, affidavits, sworn depositions. Claire's article hit in the local paper, careful but damning, and it sent ripples through the investor pool. The lenders began to ask questions publicly. The city opened an inquiry. Investors who had once toasted Tommy's vision started to call their attorneys. The same men who'd smiled when he flashed his fancy watch now asked for audits and proof. It wasn't instant. There was no cinematic collapse, no triumphant shouting on the courthouse steps. Revenge done right leaves room for law to breathe and for accountability to take hold. But I watched it happen in the small, telling ways: a withheld check, a paused construction loan, an inspector's testimony read at a hearing while Tommy fidgeted in his suit and tried to control the room with charm that used to work. He was losing the most precious leverage he had, plausible deniability. Through it all, I never forgot the photo in the garage. I kept it in my wallet like a talisman. The words on the back, "Trust is your foundation," became less a memory of what I'd lost and more a rule for what I built next. My foundation was now truth, patience, and a refusal to be rushed. If Tommy had learned to trade in quick wins and loud promises, I'd learned to trade in quiet endurance and documents that could stand up in daylight. The plan, when it finally moved from preparation into action, didn't feel like justice so much as the natural settling of a ledger. Lies and shortcuts carry interest. They compound until the account is due. Tommy had gambled his reputation on speed and greed. I had bet on the slow, steady arithmetic of proof. There were, of course, nights I wanted more than paperwork. I wanted to see him crumble in the human ways. The shame in a neighbor's look, the empty seat at a family dinner, the hush when his name was mentioned. Some of that came in small, private ways. People who once applauded started asking uncomfortable questions in public. Investors tightened their terms. His lawyers spent money and patience on damage control neither could fully buy back. But the real victory was quieter and purer. The moment a regulatory hearing reopened because of the evidence we'd gathered. The day a lender froze additional funding pending an independent audit. The morning Claire's second article published a sworn inspector's statement that contradicted every glossy claim on the Haven Estates website. One by one, the pillars that had held up Tommy's empire began to show hairline cracks. I didn't savor his ruin like a feast. The taste was bitter with the memory of what we'd once promised each other. But I did allow myself to feel the steadiness of having acted with purpose rather than fury. Revenge had become reclamation, of truth, of my name, and of the lessons Dad had written on the back of a photo. We weren't done. There was always another hearing, another board to brief, another witness to coax into courage. But the foundation had been laid, not for a monument to my victory, but for the slow, inevitable unmasking of a man who'd thought blood could be traded like a commodity. The settlement of accounts was coming, and when it did, it would be measured, legal, and undeniable. The first fissures were almost laughably mundane, the kind of small bureaucratic annoyances that feel like paper cuts until the bleeding starts. A supplier who'd always taken Tommy's check on faith called and said they needed cash up front. A permit approval that had steamed through in a day suddenly stalled, because a clerk wanted to verify something. A banker I'd once shared jokes with left a terse voicemail asking for clarification on a transfer Tommy had made 2 nights earlier. None of it on its face was dramatic, but the pattern felt like the first telltale hairline crack in a foundation you thought was solid. By the time the bank flagged an account, the hairline had widened. Lenders started asking for documents they'd previously waved away. One of Tommy's major contractors, the one who'd always been paid late but kept quietly refused to accept another invoice unless checks cleared first. Conversations that used to be full of bravado and promises turned clipped and cautious. The swagger in Tommy's walk thinned into something practiced and brittle. Then the phone rang. It was the first time in months he'd called me. Hearing his voice through the receiver felt like smelling smoke and realizing a room might be on fire. "Rob, did you talk to anyone from the county?" he asked, voice raw. "They're asking questions." I let the silence hang for a second, even though my pulse thumped like a warning drum. "No idea, Tommy," I said. "Must be your new investors." He swallowed something I couldn't hear. I could hear the panic that his polished public appearances had been hiding. For years he'd cultivated an image like a varnish, glossy and deflective. Now the varnish was cracking and the wood beneath was wet. That moment, his voice frayed, his composure gone, felt like a small private victory. But I didn't celebrate. I wasn't interested in a child's gloat. I was interested in the work finishing. Linda and I moved on the next steps we'd planned, the ones that turned gossip into procedure. We filed an anonymous complaint with the state licensing board. We included every scrap we'd found. The mismatched permits, the backdated inspection notes, the emails that didn't line up with the town records. We attached sworn statements from subcontractors who'd been too afraid to speak before. We filed them clean and surgical, the way you send a bullet straight through the center. No hiss, no flash, just certainty. At the same time, I loosened a few carefully chosen threads with Claire. She needed verified facts, not melodrama, and we gave her exactly that. The morning her piece ran, the headline hit the town like a thrown stone. Prominent developer under investigation for fraud and misuse of public funds. The words echoed off storefronts, repeated in break rooms, whispered at the diner counter where my mother still worked. It felt surreal to see a sentence about my life printed in black ink, but surreal in the way a storm that's been building finally breaks. The dominoes fell faster than I expected. Investors who had once cheered at Tommy's glossy renderings began sending terse emails asking for independent audits. Lenders stopped wiring bridge loans pending clarification. The men who'd toasted him at charity galas started answering their phones with tight, rehearsed phrases. Even some of the people who'd been shrillest in defending him went quiet when reporters started asking direct questions. The social fallout was the hardest to watch. People who'd lined up to shake Tommy's hand at ribbon cuttings now crossed the street when they saw him. Old friends averted their eyes. Where there had been nods and pats on the back, now there were clipped, awkward silences. The town likes a leader who makes it look easy. The town also loves to distance itself from scandal, and Tommy's brand had been built on both. One night, driven by a mixture of obligation and curiosity, I answered another knock at the door. When I opened it, the rain pelted us both like an accusation. Tommy stood on my porch, his suit soaked dark, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes rimmed in red. He wasn't polished. He was raw. Desperation had replaced the practiced arrogance. "You did this, didn't you?" he shouted, rain beating his voice into ragged edges. "You ruined me." You handed me to the wolves. He said it like a man who'd been taught to measure the world in transactions, as if blame could be bartered and victory could be bought back with outrage. I looked at him and felt the tilt of the years between us. The way his shoulders had tightened into something almost unrecognizable, the way the lines around his mouth had deepened not from sunlight, but from the angles of lies. I remembered the photograph in my garage, the sentence on the back in Dad's angular handwriting. "Trust is your foundation." "No, Tommy," I said slowly, the rain tracing the words between us. "You ruined yourself. I just told the truth." For a second, he looked like he might collapse. He wavered like a man whose map of the world had been redrawn by someone else's pen. He lunged for excuses. Investors' pressure, the town's expectations, the need to expand, the necessity of cutting corners. Each one felt thinner than the last. He tried to trade his culpability for sympathy, but there was nothing left to buy him out of what he'd already chosen. Over the following weeks, things accelerated. A hearing was scheduled after the licensing board accepted our documents and Linda's statement. Subcontractors came forward, some under the protection of affidavits, others with nervy courage at the thought of protecting future buyers. The county opened an inquiry. Lenders froze lines of credit pending forensic accounting. Even the glossy sales office at the Haven Estates started showing empty chairs as salespeople were pulled for questioning. Tommy fought back with the tools he'd always used: lawyers, PR statements, angry denials. He tried to remake the narrative, to paint himself as the scapegoat for a market gone awry. He scheduled press conferences where he smiled too hard and said everything he wished were true. But words, when measured against stamped documents and sworn testimony, have a hollow sound. Paper doesn't lie as well as a practiced smile. Through it all, I kept a strange reserve in my chest. I didn't revel in seeing him falter. I watched with the hollow steadiness of a man who'd learned the cost of losing everything. I had watched his hunger turn my life to ash. I was not going to let my own victory turn me into something I despised. There were nights I lay awake thinking of Dad's hands and the way he taught us to measure twice before cutting. The memory steadied me. The turn of events didn't undo the loss, but it reopened a kind of breathing room. Clients asked questions again, cautious at first, then curious. A few people reached out with apologies that were fumbling but sincere. My son Evan started to ask fewer tentative questions and more direct ones. He watched the hearings with a sober face, as if weighing what he'd seen against the man he knew. As for Tommy, the man who once wore the future like a cloak now walked smaller, as if every step risked revealing the hollow he'd built himself into. The empire he'd erected on quick wins and borrowed faith began to taste of the same things he'd once mocked: bureaucracy, oversight, the slow grind of accountability. The cracks weren't aesthetic anymore. They were structural. I didn't dance on them. I stood on the other side, hands empty but steady, and let the law and the light do what I could not do with a hammer and a shout. The work we'd started in the shadows had moved into daylight, and daylight has its own quiet justice. The rest would be for attorneys, for auditors, for judges, and for time to do what it does best: reveal what was true. The day the investigation went public, the air itself seemed to hum with tension, like a storm waiting to break. The town that had once whispered Tommy's name with admiration now said it with caution, curiosity, and finally contempt. His face, once a symbol of success plastered across billboards and glossy magazines, was now splashed across headlines that read like epitaphs: state auditors, raid developer's office in fraud probe local business, icon under investigation for embezzlement, the fall of the golden boy of Ohio construction. It was as if every wall he'd built to hide behind was suddenly made of glass. The world could see through him now, and there was nowhere left to run. Within days, auditors descended on his company like a swarm of quiet, determined ghosts. Men in dark suits combed through filing cabinets, lifted boxes of documents, copied hard drives. They spoke in low, efficient voices, their movements deliberate, surgical. I knew those offices intimately. The smell of printer ink and sawdust, The faint hum of the old HVAC unit that never quite worked right. But seeing them in news footage now felt like watching a home you'd once loved being dismantled piece by piece. His accounts were the first to go. Banks froze them overnight, not out of cruelty but caution. Without money to move, Tommy couldn't pay his lawyers, his contractors, or even his own employees. The empire he'd built, one handshake, and headline at a time was being stripped bare by the same financial machinery he'd once bent to his will. And then came the public inquiry. Television. Vans lined up outside the courthouse. Cameras waited, hungry for a glimpse of the man who had once hosted charity galas and promised to bring modern living to the heart of Ohio. When Tommy finally emerged from the back of a black sedan, wearing a suit that looked suddenly too big for him, the shutters went off like gunfire. He flinched. For the first time, he didn't look like a businessman. He looked like a man who had finally realized the truth he'd been outrunning for years. That charm can't save you when the numbers turn against you. Inside, the hearing was brutal. Linda testified first, calm, precise, unflinching. She laid out the timeline, the forged permits, the payments made to silence inspectors. Her voice didn't tremble once. Every fact she spoke was a nail sealing the coffin of Tommy's vision. I sat in the back row, my hands folded, listening as the truth we'd built piece by piece was finally given a voice under oath. Next came the auditors, their binders thick with evidence. They spoke of discrepancies, duplicate invoices, shell accounts, the kind of technical crimes Tommy had always dismissed as paperwork mistakes. Except now those mistakes had intent behind them, and a name attached to every line. His name. When Tommy took the stand, the transformation was jarring. Gone was the slick, confident developer who'd shaken hands and posed for photographs. His voice cracked as he tried to spin the narrative. Bad accounting, rogue employees, miscommunication. But no one believed him. Not the press, not the officials, and not even the people who'd once stood by him. There's a strange stillness that settles over a room when the truth finally wins. It isn't loud. It doesn't roar. It just is. You could feel it then. That quiet gravity of justice taking its rightful place. When the verdict came, temporary seizure of assets pending further investigation, criminal charges of fraud and misappropriation, immediate suspension of business operations. The collective gasp in the room was almost physical. For everyone else, it was news. For me, it was closure. Tommy's downfall wasn't cinematic. It wasn't fireworks or fury. It was the slow, inevitable collapse of something that had been hollow for years. His investors turned away. His lawyers stopped returning calls once the money ran dry. The employees who'd once idolized him cleared out their desks in silence, eyes down. Even his fancy car dealership pulled the lease on his Mercedes. The golden boy of Ohio construction had turned to lead overnight. The day they came for him, it was raining again, almost like the night this all began. I watched from my porch as the police car pulled up outside his gated house across town. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just stood there, soaked to the skin, while two officers led him down the steps in handcuffs. The cameras flashed, and for a brief second his eyes met mine across the street. There was something hollow in them. Not anger, not hatred, just the emptiness of a man who'd finally run out of lies to tell. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't even feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the anger and the ache, there was still the ghost of a brother I had once loved. The boy who used to dream big and laugh easily before greed carved something cold into his soul. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was balance. The scales had righted themselves not through violence or rage, but through truth, the one thing Tommy had always underestimated. And as the world watched his empire crumble, as the headlines changed from visionary to fraud, I finally saw the reflection I'd been waiting for. For once, the world saw him for who he truly was. And maybe, just maybe, they saw me too, not as the fool who'd signed away his life, but as the man who'd built something real, even if it was only the quiet strength to survive. When the rain stopped that evening, I walked out to the edge of my porch and let the cool air fill my lungs. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest lifted. The storm had passed, not cleanly, not gently, but completely. And standing there, I realized something profound. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply breathes. It took me nearly 2 years to piece my life back together. Not in one heroic sweep, but in quiet, patient steps that no one but me ever saw. The world had moved on from the chaos of Tommy's downfall, from the headlines and the whispers, but I was still there, standing in the wreckage, figuring out who I was without the shadow of his empire hanging over me. At first, it was hard to even begin. My name had been tangled with his for so long that people didn't know how to separate us. Some saw me as a victim, others as a collaborator, and a few just pitied me. I hated all three labels. I wanted to earn back something simpler: respect. So I started small. I picked up consulting jobs helping local businesses with their permits and contracts, guiding them through the same bureaucratic mess that had once buried me. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. I found comfort in that, in the steady rhythm of rebuilding something with my own two hands. No shortcuts, no lies. Just slow, deliberate effort. Linda stood by me through all of it. There were days when I woke up exhausted, when the past felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. But she never once looked at me like I was broken. She'd bring me coffee in the mornings and say, "One day at a time, but that's how you build something real." And she was right. Eventually, opportunity found us again, not through luck, but through the quiet reputation we'd built for doing things right. People started coming to us for help. Small business owners, homeowners, folks who'd been burned by big developers and crooked deals. They trusted us because we'd lived the same pain they had. That's how Horizon Restoration was born. The name came to Linda one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip low over the ridge. "It's not about what's gone," she said softly. "It's about what's ahead, the horizon." The name stuck. We didn't just restore buildings. We restored faith in honesty and hard work and second chances. The office was small at first. 2 desks, 1 old coffee machine that sputtered every other morning, and a wall covered in sketches and ideas. But there was laughter there. Real laughter. The kind that had been missing for far too long. Months turned into years, and slowly the noise of Tommy's scandal faded into the background. His name stopped appearing in the papers. The empire he'd built had been dismantled and auctioned off brick by brick. But I didn't care to keep track anymore. I'd finally learned that closure doesn't come from watching someone else fall. It comes from standing on your own again. One late afternoon, as I was cleaning out some old files from my new office, I came across a worn leather folder I hadn't seen in years. Inside it was that same old photo, Dad, Tommy, and me standing beside our first project site. I remember the day it was taken. We were sweaty, sunburned, and proud. Back then, everything seemed possible. I held the photo for a long time. For years, that picture had been a reminder of everything I'd lost. My family, my faith in people, my sense of belonging. But now looking at it, I didn't feel anger or bitterness. I just felt stillness, a quiet peace. Because the truth was, losing everything had stripped away the illusions I'd been clinging to. It showed me what was real and what never had been. Tommy's success, our family's reputation, even the dream we thought we were chasing. All of it had been built on fragile lies. But what I had now, though smaller, was solid, honest. That evening, I placed the photo on my new office shelf, not as a reminder of pain, but as a marker of growth. I realized that rebuilding isn't about erasing the past, it's about making peace with it. It's about understanding that ashes aren't just what's left after destruction. They're the soil from which something stronger can grow. Horizon Restoration flourished slowly but steadily. We hired a few employees, expanded into nearby towns, and started sponsoring apprenticeships for local kids who wanted to learn construction the right way, with integrity, not ambition alone. Watching those young faces light up when they finished their first project was worth more to me than any deal Tommy ever closed. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd drive past the empty lot where his old office once stood. The building had been torn down long ago, the land cleared and ready for something new. Every time I looked at that patch of earth, I felt something like gratitude. Because from the ashes of what was destroyed, I'd built something that mattered, not for revenge, not for pride, but for peace. Now, when the sun sets over the horizon, that same horizon our company was named after, I often find myself smiling. The pain that once defined me has softened into something wiser, something gentler. I no longer carry the weight of what happened as a burden, but as a story, one that taught me that even in ruin, there can be rebirth, and that's the quiet truth about starting over. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to finally see what was never real to begin with, and to find the strength to build what always should have been. People ask me all the time if I regret it, if exposing Tommy was worth it. They say revenge never heals, that it only deepens the wound, and maybe they're right, for some people. But for me, it wasn't about revenge in the end. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken from me long before the company, before the money. My peace, my dignity, my truth. When someone you love betrays you, it doesn't just break your trust. It fractures the ground you stand on. You start questioning everything, like your memories, your choices, even your own worth. That's what Tommy did to me. He didn't just steal my business. He stole my reflection, the version of myself I thought I could see clearly in the mirror. For months after it all came crashing down, I'd catch my own eyes staring back at me, and I wouldn't recognize the man looking back. People like to believe that betrayal comes with a single moment, a breaking point, a knife in the back, a final straw. But it doesn't. Betrayal starts long before the act itself. It's in the small lies, the excuses, the missed phone calls, the shifting tone in someone's voice. It grows like mold in the corners of trust, quiet and slow, until one day it consumes everything. When Tommy betrayed me, I lost more than a company. I lost faith in the very idea of family. And that's the cruelest part of it all. Betrayal by blood cuts deeper because it carries your name. Every shared memory becomes evidence of your own blindness. Every laugh, every promise turns sour. But here's what time taught me. Pain can either poison you or purify you. For a long time, I let it poison me. I lived off anger. It fueled me, drove me, gave me purpose when I had none. I told myself I wanted justice, but deep down I wanted him to feel the emptiness I did. I wanted him to wake up one morning and understand the kind of hurt that doesn't go away. The kind that keeps you company in silence. And when it finally happened, when the world turned its back on him, when his empire crumbled and his name became a cautionary tale, I thought I'd feel whole again. I thought victory would taste sweet. But it didn't. It was quiet. Too quiet. There was no joy in watching him fall. No celebration. No triumph. Just stillness. Because the truth is, there's no real satisfaction in seeing the person who hurt you destroyed. You think it'll fill the void, but it doesn't. It just leaves a different kind of emptiness. What did heal me, though, was truth. Pure, unfiltered truth. See, when you've been lied to for so long, truth becomes sacred. It doesn't roar, it doesn't demand, it just stands. Silent, unwavering, unmovable. That's what I learned when the dust settled. I didn't have to destroy Tommy to win. I didn't have to match his deceit or sink to his level. I just had to let the truth breathe. And it did the rest. It took months, even years, but eventually people saw. They saw who he really was. They saw what I had endured. And more importantly, I saw myself again. I realized that the man he tried to bury had roots too deep to die. That's the real price of betrayal. Not what it costs you in money or time or reputation, but what it takes from your soul. Because when someone you love sells you out, they're not just trading your trust for gain. They're taking a piece of your heart and pawning it off to the highest bidder. And you can't buy that piece back. All you can do is rebuild around the space it left behind. Would I do it again? Yes, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Because truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be known. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone listening, anyone who's been betrayed by the very people they would have died for, it's this. You don't have to destroy them to rise again. You don't have to waste your life plotting their downfall. The truth has its own way of doing the work for you. All you need is patience. Time is the great equalizer. It strips away illusions, exposes intentions, and reveals character. The same people who once stood behind Tommy now avoid his name like a curse. And me? I walk freely now, not as a victim, not as a man obsessed with vengeance, but as someone who finally learned the cost of trusting blindly. The price of betrayal is steep. It takes years. It takes sleep. It takes the parts of you that used to believe without question. But what you get in return if you endure it is clarity. You learn to see people for who they are, not who you wish they'd be. You learn to listen when your instincts whisper instead of shouting. And most importantly, you learn that peace isn't found in revenge, it's found in release. So if someone you love has turned their back on you, don't chase them and don't curse them. Just step aside and let truth run its course. Because no matter how long it takes, no matter how deep the wound, truth always finds its way to the surface, and when it does, You won't need to fight anymore. You'll just stand there, quiet, watching the storm fade, and you'll know, in your heart, that you didn't win by destroying someone else. You won by surviving them. Betrayal doesn't just test you, it defines you. It strips away the layers you thought made you who you are, the comforts of trust and belonging, and leaves you standing alone in the raw truth of yourself. It's in that emptiness, that unbearable silence after the storm, where you finally discover what you're truly made of. When Tommy betrayed me, I thought he broke me. I thought everything that mattered, family, loyalty, legacy, had been destroyed beyond repair. But I was wrong. He didn't destroy me. He revealed me. He forced me to look in the mirror and see the man beneath the titles, beneath the business, beneath the blood ties. For years I had believed family was everything. I thought that because Tommy was my brother, he was a part of my soul, that we shared something unshakable, something sacred. But betrayal has a way of separating truth from illusion. What I learned, painfully and completely, is that family isn't measured by DNA or last names. It's measured by integrity, by the quiet promise that you'll stand by one another even when it's inconvenient, even when there's nothing to gain. Tommy had my name, but not my values. He had my trust, but not my loyalty. And that difference, that invisible line, was everything. When the dust settled, when the lawyers were gone, when the newspapers moved on to the next scandal, I stood alone in the aftermath of it all. And for the first time in years, I could actually breathe. Because here's the truth I never saw before. I didn't lose my family that day. I lost the illusion of one. And that realization, as painful as it was, set me free. For decades, I had been building my life around a belief that family would always protect me, that blood was a guarantee of loyalty. But blood can lie. It can manipulate, deceive, and destroy just like anyone else. What truly defines family are the people who choose you when they don't have to, the ones who stand beside you when there's nothing left to gain. After Tommy's downfall, I rebuilt my life brick by brick, not just my business, but my sense of self. And in that slow rebuilding, I learned something precious. Peace doesn't come from revenge or from getting even. It comes from acceptance, from knowing that what's meant to leave will leave, and what's meant to stay will stand by you no matter what. I learned that forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of their actions. I don't forgive Tommy because he deserves it. I forgive him because I deserve peace, and in that peace I found strength. Not the kind that shouts or fights or demands recognition, but the kind that stands quietly, unwavering. In the aftermath of betrayal, it's strange. You know, how something so devastating can become the very thing that saves you. Betrayal forced me to look at every corner of my life and ask, what's real? It burned away the false friendships, the shallow partnerships, the people who smiled only when the money flowed. It left me with very little, but everything that remained was genuine. Sometimes, the fire has to burn everything down before you can see what's truly indestructible. That's what I learned. That's what I carry with me now. Because the truth is, betrayal doesn't break you, it reveals you. It shows you the cracks in your foundation, the weaknesses you ignored, the illusions you clung to out of fear. But it also shows you your resilience, your courage, your capacity to start over even when the world has turned its back. And maybe that's what life really is, not about avoiding the pain, but about learning to grow from it. Now, when I look back on everything, the company, the betrayal, the loss, I don't see tragedy anymore. I see transformation. I see a man who was stripped down to nothing but still found the strength to stand tall. So what did I learn? I learned that peace doesn't come from what you hold on to. It comes from what you let go of. I learned that loyalty isn't proven by words but by actions when times get hard. And I learned that sometimes, the greatest gift betrayal gives you is the truth, the kind that hurts at first, but heals you forever. I walk through life differently now. I don't chase trust. I earn it and protect it. I don't confuse family with familiarity, and I don't mistake kindness for weakness, because I've seen what happens when the people closest to you turn away, and I've also seen how strong you can become when you have to stand alone. At the end of it all, when everything was gone, the business, the reputation, the illusion of brotherhood, I was left with something purer, stronger, and far more valuable than anything I'd lost: peace. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone's approval. The kind that comes from knowing that no matter who betrays you, you can still stand, and you can still build something beautiful from the ashes. That's what I learned. And if I had to lose everything again to gain that lesson, I would